Hi, I'm Leon Gorin, president of PEO Leadership, a peer-to-peer leadership advisory firm. We're an amazing community of CEOs, presidents, and senior executives. Ask yourself, are you learning as fast as the world is changing? It's time for Ontario business leaders to band together for counsel and support. It's time for you to tap into the business wisdom of our peer groups and unlock new ways to grow. I want you to come out of this COVID crisis a better leader and your organization ready for what's next. Take the first step at peo-leadership.com. Special thanks to E&Y for helping us bring you today's PEO Leadership's Way Forward podcast. So Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to kick us off with a little introduction of where we're going. For those that I guess I'm meeting for the first time, my name is Leon Gorin. I'm the CEO of PEO Leadership, and welcome to the Way Forward live webcast series. And it's it's funny, it's December 2021. We started this back in March of 2020. And who would have thought that we still be running at this point in time? It was originally kicked off, for those that don't know the history around. At PEO Leadership, we have a pretty strong community of leaders, both running multinationals and SMEs, and we meet on a regular basis. So at that time, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was so much uncertainty around where we were going, our people, all that type of stuff. Well, it's funny, fast forward to today, and we still have all this uncertainty. We just have different elements of this uncertainty. Now we're talking inflation, we're talking rising wages. If you're a manufacturer, you really have no idea what your costs of goods are going to be in the next 4 or 5 months. How many of you have actually been able to budget your 20 or forecast your 2022 numbers? Everything is out there. And so, listen, it doesn't need to be this way. You don't need to be operating in a vacuum. And if you are, urge you to give us a shout at peo-leadership.com and let us help you out. I mean, we've got advisors. We run advisory boards where you get to share some of that information. And those issues and challenges you're facing, you're not facing them alone. There are other people going through it. So I'm going to kick us off. Like I said at the beginning, this was an element. We brought this series together as a way to open up some of the thought leadership beyond just a small community of, let's say we have 120 leaders participate, but to a much broader community. And so every month we've brought you someone who is outstanding. And this month I am so excited to welcome Andrew Winston. And Andrew, I'm going to do a little bit of an intro here. For those that don't know, Andrew is a globally recognized and widely read expert on megatrends and how to build companies that thrive by serving the world. His first book, Green to Gold, has reached more than 100,000 people in 7 languages. Inc. magazine included Green to Gold on its all-time list of 30 books that every manager should own. His book, The Big Pivot, was selected as one of the best business books by Strategy+Business magazine. Andrew's latest book, which I have right here, Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take, and it's co-authored by the renowned CEO Paul Polman of Unilever, is a finalist for the Financial Times McKinsey Business Book of the Year award, which must be coming up pretty soon because it is December. So I'm thinking they may have announced that already. Andrew is selected for Thinkers 50 radar list of 30 thinkers to watch in 2020. He appeared in major media such as Bloomberg, The Wall Street Journal, Time, Business Week, New York Times, and CNBC. He's got views on strategy have been sought after by the world's leading companies, including 3M, DuPont, HP, J&J, Kimberly-Clark, Marriott. The list goes on, PepsiCo, PwC. He's a highly respected and dynamic speaker, reaching audiences of thousands at executive meetings and around the world and at high-profile events like TED, with an entertaining message of practical optimism. The world's challenges are great, but business has the tools, resources, and creativity to build a prosperous world. He started his career with BCG in management strategy. He's also had management positions in strategy marketing at Time Warner and MTV, BA in economics from Princeton, an MBA from Columbia, master's in environmental management from Yale, lives in Greenwich, Connecticut with his wife and 2 sons. Andrew, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Oh, who was that guy? That was quite a bio.
I love the bio.
I'm lying for it. Thanks for the intro.
Oh, it's great. So just from a logistical perspective, I thought we'd spend about 30 minutes. You and I will dialogue a little bit. I've got some questions I want to ask you, and then open it up for sure Q&A to the audience, and go back and forth on that. So I'm going to start a very high level and ask you sort of when and what sparked your passion and dedication to sustainable business? Like, when did it happen? Something clicked in you.
Well, first I want to say your message at the beginning about we're not alone, I think is so important. And it's actually kind of one of the underlying themes of, I guess, all my work, but especially this last book, which we'll talk about, that we have a lot of really big challenges, but we can do them together. So that was a good starting point, I think. So my background, you read in my bio, I was at Boston Consulting Group. I was doing strategy and marketing jobs kind of in my 20s. And then what sparked the interest, or what sparked the potential or the possibility to leave, was actually the dot-com crash. I had left Viacom, big company thing, went to a startup, and we crashed. I left the big company world and went to a dot-com 3 weeks before the market crash in early 2000. So I've done bad timing in my career, and I've done good timing, and the latter's a lot better. You can't control it, but and I found myself unemployed and had just gotten married. So I actually had someone who could make a living. We found out we were going under basically while I was on my honeymoon. And I joked that I turned to my wife and said, that richer and poorer thing that we just vowed to, how do you feel about poor, as I'm now out of work? And I basically, had kind of a personal interest in how the world worked and use of resources. I wasn't really what I guess people sometimes call a tree hugger. I didn't grow up camping and all that. I just had a practical view that this probably can't continue the way the world works, the way capitalism works. And I just started studying that while I was, out of work, and said, do I want to go back to a regular strategy and marketing job, or do something that kind of uses I had an MBA already, uses my business training for something kind of larger. And that's, where I ended up. And that was almost exactly 20 years ago. And I went back to school, started working with a couple of professors there, and then wrote my first book with a professor. It was called Green to Gold, and it, sold 100 and something thousand copies now. And it, kind of laid out how companies can create value by thinking green. It was really fairly basic. But at the same time, I get asked still, it's still being bought, and I get asked still to kind of give talks about it to companies that are just coming to the table and kind of getting that, hey, we got to talk about this now. But, I've evolved over the last 15 years into kind of more and more, I think, aggressive and strategic books that are pushing the boundaries more. And I, speak and consult and advise for a living. I kind of made a career out of all this somehow. Every year, I'm sure it's going to stop. I'm like, there's no way I can continue doing this mix of work. No one will keep paying me to speak, whatever, but it keeps going. So
that's awesome. So you've been doing this for 20 years, right? And so now you released the book, A Net Positive. How does it differ from the other concepts? Like we heard less bad. We've all been talking about sustainability, net zero. And so I just, obviously it's not a play on words because you really believe in this, but what is so different about net positive?
I mean, on some level, it's just about ambition, right? It's the ambition for what your business can be and what you can be as a leader. Just to quickly define it for people, we define net positive, as a business that thrives and profits by serving the world. That's kind of the largest level. More practically, that means you're setting out to improve the well-being of everybody that you touch. And for, a multinational, that's a lot of people. It's like the whole world. So it's your employees, your customers and consumers, your suppliers, the communities you operate in, and doing that through every product and service, every factory, every country you operate in. And this is kind of the North Star. There's no company that can claim that exactly. I mean, probably even Tesla that's putting out products that are good for the world. They have a footprint, So these are not easy things to attain. And what's different is, for most of the sustainable business discussion for the last 20, 30, 40 years, it has been fundamentally like, hey, you got to improve your footprint. You got to do what you're doing with less bad. And it's been incremental in approach. And we're not the first to say this. And I've been writing about things like this for years, and so have others. But the scale of the problems we face now, and frankly, how long we waited to do anything about them, in particular climate, but now inequality as well has grown into an enormous stress on society. And, the kind of attack on biodiversity, the web of life that we forget we're a part of. The problems are just really big, and we waited too long, and we have to move much faster now. And so I think, Paul, my co-author, and I believe the leaders have to go into positive territory, have to start regenerating and repairing the world so that we have the resources to continue to provide a quality of life for what's going to be 9 or 10 billion people. Because we're really not clear we can do that in the current mode, because we're drawing down on kind of future resources all the time. We use more every year than the earth produces. You can't do that if you pulled off your balance sheet every year, you can only do it for so long. And the question is when, and I think we're seeing some of those collapse moments already happening.
Oh, that's great. So in your book, well, before I even go that, what I took from your net positive and reading in the book too, it is, climate is the big driver here, but inequality you focus in that book as well. DEI, these are all issues that are really facing us today, right? You talked about biodiversity as well. So to me, that changed the dialogue when I was reading it compared to just sustainability or net zero. In your book, you refer to 5 core principles, and I'm going to drive on those 5, Andrew, because what I'm trying to do is you got these leaders in the room, and it's always about what practical stuff can I take away and actually start to implement or think about within our organization. And you have these 5 core principles that center on responsibility and believe that it can take a company's performance to a new level, right? In terms of profitability, sustainability, just performance in general. You talk about these 5 core principles that you talk about it can help corporate leaders. In the room here today, you're going to have entrepreneurs, and you're going to have, I call those corporate leaders hired guns, right? They're hired in, they're working for the multinational. But you talk about them being able to expand their horizons, rethink their jobs, and reshape the role of their business in society today, and take a good company to becoming a great company, which is kind of from good to great, coming back to that concept. So you had 5 of them, and I thought we'd go through the 5, and maybe you can talk a little bit why you've listed this as one, and perhaps give us some examples to share. So the first one was the ownership of all impacts and consequences, intended or not. And I know that's a big one, but why? And give us an example of a company or leader that's actually doing this and how they sort of are doing this.
So, I mean, we started with the first one, and like most lists, it's the most important. It really is what underlies and drives the rest of the story, that what business is fundamentally done, and logically, because it's legal and it's economically viable, has been to externalize costs, right? That's the economic term for it. We don't pay in business for the things we do, like put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We don't pay for using up land that diminishes species. We don't pay for lots of things. And so in a way, we're not taking ownership, right? And laws have been put in place over centuries and especially decades to give people ownership rights, to give people, air quality rights, so that you start to give companies responsibility. But we're saying you got to be more proactive than that, both because it's the right thing to do, but it also opens up enormous opportunities. If you're the one to identify some issues and then help solve them, I think you have a potential huge market. So ownership of all impacts means your business, it is not just, did I emit something out of a factory smokestack, right? It's much bigger than that. Yeah. Excuse me. Most large companies now are reporting their carbon emissions in what are called 3 scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. That's kind of the big extension of thinking in the last 5-10 years, where scope 1 is your own direct emissions, scope 2 is the emissions from the grid that you're buying from, and scope 3 is your suppliers and your customers. And that's really big thinking for most companies. And because it's usually much larger. The footprint is much larger outside of your own control. And that's the first kind of acknowledgement. Wow, if we want to reduce the carbon emissions, our own are often a tiny percentage of the total that we impact. And so we're suggesting that there's kind of even further levels of thinking about your impact out to policy and advocacy. Are you supporting policies that, tackle climate change or support regenerative agriculture? And are you kind of building a society that's based on fossil fuels or consumption? I mean, how much are you contributing to us going in the right direction? There's certainly more examples of companies not taking that responsibility than taking it. And we can, I assume there's probably a lot of folks in here that work in tech, and tech is everyone's favorite sector. And I think if we can find some time, we should talk about Facebook and its role in the world. I think it's a perfect example of having this extended impact. Something that started as, let's check out cute girls and boys, now has a direct impact on democracy globally. I mean, it's potentially one of, I think, the most impactful company in the world now, and maybe in history, because of the scale of it. But the companies taking responsibility, you'll see some of the other tech leaders, for example, Microsoft and Google, setting really aggressive carbon goals to sequester carbon equal to all that they've emitted since they were founded. That's kind of going back and taking full responsibility, and then starting to sequester carbon, invest in that, start to move the grid that they're in, the grids that they're putting new renewables on, so that they become entirely renewable. They're just working with the systems At the same time, though, those companies haven't really been as proactive on policy as they need to be, and they've let some policies that fight climate action kind of keep moving forward. So it's a mixed bag, right, with all these guys. And Unilever, the company we focus on the most for obvious reasons in the book, has taken broad responsibility for everything from the source of the carbon and petrochemicals in their packaging to the effect of their advertising, right? They've had famous campaigns like Dove Beauty on women and self-image. And they started this campaign, the Unstereotype Alliance, a number of years ago with other big advertisers, where you stop having basically 50s white couples representing everybody in every advertisement. They're just thinking about how they impact the way we all kind of think about ourselves. So that's kind of the broader impact that you can think about.
Okay. That's helpful. The second one, you had operating for the long-term benefit of business and society. It was funny because I picked that up and I thought about a starting point is almost unlocking the company's soul, like their purpose, right? And you had a bunch like Unilever to make sustainable living commonplace, Bayer, which is a client of ours too, and maybe in the room, health for all, hunger for one. The importance of doing that, because it's not easy to actually, you've done a lot of strategy in your early days with BCG. I'm sure you've been strategy with all these stuff. To actually formalizing that purpose, how important is that as a starting point?
Critical, right? I mean, but on some level, it's easy. I mean, you can sit in a room and for 3 hours come up with, a purpose for your company that seems in line with what you do. I think it's harder to do it, in a deep way and legitimately, and really do what, Paul did at Unilever, and they had kind of been in touch with for decades, but he really went back to the founding. And I think that's a process that a lot of companies have found is really helpful. This part of our story, the book, is really kind of a pushback on the 50 years we've had of shareholder primacy, where only serving shareholder value has been the focus of all business. And we're obviously not the only ones saying this. There's big announcements from CEOs and other groups saying we got to broaden who we're serving. If you go back to the founding of a lot of companies, the reason was not shareholder value. It was usually to solve some problem, right? It was identify a customer. And this is stuff Drucker said, and famous CEOs have said for years. The purpose of a business is really to identify a customer and solve a problem for them. It's really, in some sense, that simple. So what is that purpose? What is the thing you do uniquely for the world? And then acting in keeping with that purpose is really the harder work, and really what, in some sense, the whole book is about. And how do you create the consistency in the organization, in the way you lead, and in the goals you set, in the culture you're building, in the partnerships you seek with the world, to be consistent with that purpose, and how you help your executives and then kind of all employees find their own personal connection to that larger purpose, or discover that they don't connect to it and maybe they should be somewhere else, which is fine, right? I mean, I think people finding the place they fit the best is going to be better for everyone, and there was certainly some of that at Unilever too. So yeah, the purpose is really, really core, and I think without it, it's really hard to know what to do when there's tough questions. And for, I think what's happening now to business, the pressure on business to take a role in society is more than it's ever been, and it's accelerating, I think, really clearly. And if you don't have that kind of core to turn back to, it's kind of hard to know what to say or do in tough moments.
That's good. It's funny because purpose is a big thing. We've been talking about that for the past year, really trying to push organizations, especially on the SME side, to take the time. You're right, you can pound it out in a room, but what's really interesting is most organizations it's not as easy to pound it out in a room within a day. In terms of, they actually will start it, leave it, and then get into the other strategic initiatives, which ultimately, if they don't align to a purpose that you've established, you could be going off track pretty quickly.
Well, it can be scary because you also might discover things you shouldn't be doing, right? Anymore, which can be, some big part of your business, some cash cow. I mean, look, you're seeing it in profound ways at oil and gas, tobacco, where they have to create this is going back to Clayton Christensen and, innovator's dilemma. They have to create the alternatives before someone else does. And I think the sustainability agenda is really just a planetary and social agenda. It's not set by Greenpeace or liberals. It's set by actual thresholds in the planet, like how much climate we have, how much stable climate we have. And that can mean you can't do certain things anymore, or you got to phase out. That's scary. It's also exciting, right? I mean, if you stayed stagnant, what business has ever stayed stagnant? My dad worked for IBM for 35 years. They completely changed who they were. right about the time he was retiring, right? They became a service business. He was selling mainframes and PCs. So things change. The best companies change.
So the third point, you've already talked a little bit about creating positive returns for all stakeholders, thinking bigger and broader. I think you've sort of touched on it. It's not just the shareholders of the business, it's everyone you're impacting outside of that, those that are handling your products, those that are not even touching your products at the end of the day. So let me drive into the fourth one, which is driving shareholder value as a result, not as a goal.
Right.
And I know the BlackRock, everybody's looking at this thing. They're looking at shareholder value in a different way. I think some of them are talking it. I don't believe they're all doing it because investors are still forcing quarterly reporting. Profit is a big driver. Right. If you're actually, the one conflicting thing I have with that is if you're actually trying to drive shareholder value, aren't you ultimately going to end up in the same spot because of the external pressures on you by society?
Well, yes and no. I think it's, I could take that same sentence, we're going to end up at the same spot and spin it in a really good way, which is you're going to end up serving multiple stakeholders. The difference between those two statements is not really about shareholders and stakeholders. It's short versus long term. That's the fundamental difference. If you're serving the short term, the next 3 months, you'll do things that sacrifice the long term to hit your quarterly numbers. And there's been surveys for years showing CFOs, CEOs admitting, like huge portions of them, that they would do something that would sacrifice the longer term value of the company if it hits their numbers this quarter. If you take the longer term view, and this doesn't have to be 100 years, right? I mean, the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years of a business, which the C-suite and board are supposed to be protecting, you are going to serve stakeholders. How can you not? You have to serve, attract and retain the best talent. You have to satisfy customers. You have to live well and in productive partnership with the communities you operate in, right? These are things you would do anyway. So I think you can end up in the same spot in the right way. The problem is, how do you kind of get some release from that short-term pressure? And the subtitle of the book starts with courage, and that's not random, right? When we get to the leadership elements in the book, courage is really the core. And as many different kind of famous people have said, courage is the most important because without it, the others are probably moot or hard to get to. So it takes courage to push back. And Paul did that early on at Unilever and told investors, I'm not talking to you quarterly. Didn't mean they didn't have quarterly reports. They were a public company. Right. He just wasn't doing guidance, and freed him up to kind of run the business for the long term. And all of the kind of division and brand managers and everybody below him also were more freed up to think about the longer term. And their stock has done great and the company's grown. I mean, they're consumer products companies, so they go up and down with the economy like anybody. They're not Amazon. They're not going to grow at that pace, but they took a longer term view. And I think it's just, and there's plenty of investors who do want that, right? There's all the institutional, and then I think the smarter Wall Street ones as well that don't want to be just spinning stocks every few months. So it really is a time frame thing. But I think it is philosophical to say the shareholders will do fine after you've done the thing the business does, which is satisfy a customer, get the best people, all of those things that a business does well. And I don't think that's radical. It's actually kind of really old school in a lot of ways.
No, that's right. I don't think anything's actually fundamentally changed, because ultimately, especially with the media today and the exposure, you have to comply. You actually need to move in that direction, and you actually got to listen to what the world's saying or society's saying. Otherwise, you'll be canceled. Look at the cancel culture that happens out there, or a canceled product. Forget it's an individual. Let me ask you your fifth one, and I think this is an interesting one, and maybe you can give us some thought process on how you would actually start to think about it, and that is partnering to drive systemic change. Because I think in your book, you talk about actually even partnering with competitors, which for a lot of leaders here, that would take a lot of courage, number one. Two, but they don't necessarily think that way. Like, it's a little different. So how do you go in, you're consulting these business, how do you get them to start thinking about that? And then how do they even approach it?
So, I mean, it's so important, and really the core of the book, it really builds through this purpose and kind of setting goals and building trust and transparency. Those are the kind of initial steps to get to partnership. And there's kind of 2 chapters that are the heart of the book about different kinds of partnerships. And again, it comes back to what I said before, the problems are too big. But also the solutions that you need can be broad and can help an entire sector, an entire value chain operate better and more efficiently. I mean, I think, first of all, the large companies, at least, they are working with competitors. There's so many partnerships now. There's the trade associations, which have long been partnerships to go lobby for the same things, but also to bring them together to share knowledge in certain ways. Everyone's got to, read that boilerplate legal stuff at the beginning of every meeting about competition. But it comes down to, what are you competing on? One of my favorite examples in this whole space is an old one, because it takes a while to see the results. Starting like 15 years ago, the big beverage companies and kind of food companies that had refrigerators, they worked together with Greenpeace, which was like heresy, and developed with their suppliers new refrigerants that were less damaging to the climate and somewhat to the ozone layer. And they worked with competitors because fundamentally no one's buying Coke or Pepsi based on the refrigerant in the machine, but it's a shared problem that they were going to face more and more regulation about, that they could find cheaper solutions to, that they could bring the cost of a better solution, a better technology down. It just doesn't serve companies in many ways to compete with each other. There's so much pre-competitive work to be done to just bring the whole cost structure of a new set of solutions down. And even the world's largest companies, none of them are big enough to do that. Walmart, I've seen many times share technologies they're working on building efficiency or bringing solar into retail environments, because they want the scale to rise so that the price comes down. That's their ultimate goal. And I think the best companies feel like, if we're sharing this, and we talk about this a little bit in the book, if you're getting to kind of shared solutions, not every company is going to be equally able to take advantage of that and use it in their marketing or use it in their R&D or whatever it is. And so the most, I think, net positive, the ones that are set up with purpose and have kind of the best people, are going to move quicker. So there's still competitive advantage. You're just coming to these things that you need to do, but you can't do alone. And there's just a lot of them now. I mean, the reality is companies are, think about how big companies are now and the scale they have operating in 180 countries, things that were ridiculous to even think about, a couple generations ago. They're the scale of countries. And so they need to work together like the UN does, they're just too big. So I think the opportunities are just enormous. It does take a little bit of mental. I think working with competitors is almost easier, we've seen, than working with like an NGO and kind of being trusting with them, or working with the government. Those are the almost harder ones. Because I think with peers, you kind of look at each other and you all kind of agree on what business is about, but you're looking at an NGO who might think, I have a different set of goals, right? And government has a different set of goals.
So let me ask you this, and maybe it's an unfair question, but you walk into a new business, not a new business, an establishment, but you're the CEO, and pick a CPG, it could be a CPG company, let's say it's $50 to $100 million today. What's your first 90 days look like? Is it any different than it would have been 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think it really is. It's funny you said the first 90 days, because we were just, Paul and I were on the phone for a big meeting with our publisher, Harvard Business Press. And we were, one of their top couple sellers in these first couple months, and this last half. One of their big sellers is the first 90 days. It's a book a lot of people have bought, right? And it's a kind of a perennial bestseller for them. And that's what everybody wants in a business book, is you get this perennial thing going. And I think we will. I think my books have sold for years. They don't kind of tend to die out. They have this long tail. But and we've been talking about this lately, the first 90 days. I think, look, it's just a different world, right? You're coming in, that the pressures are building. I've referred to it a couple times obliquely here, but let me just say point blank that the expectations of business to have a stance and kind of consistent policies and public actions on a whole range of issues now has just exploded. And it was partly the pandemic. It was the killing of George Floyd. It was the continued rise of Me Too. All of these things. Think what happened last year. Every organization of almost any size felt the need to put out a statement about racial equity. There had been killings before for years, right? Like there was something about these kind of tipping points. And so if you're coming in to run an organization now, you better get a pretty good sense of where you stand on a lot of these issues, and have you been public and consistent. We have on the website for the book, which is netpositive.world, what we call a readiness assessment. It's 25 questions that are not meant to say how net positive are you, but really, have you got kind of the stuff together, the information, the questions you should be asking to kind of get ready for a journey. And they're tough, but some of it's just about, do you know your footprint? Do you know how you affect the big, big megatrends in the world, climate and inequality, and how they affect you? Do you know what your stakeholders expect of you? Just this kind of basic info that companies have a different range of knowledge on. Some are really have got that locked down. Many don't. And that's what I think often those first 90 days have got to be, just like you've always heard about CEOs come in and do big information gathering. They Paul did this when he got to Unilever. They tour the world, right? They go to different markets, they gather info. I think it's the same now. It's just the info you need to gather has to also be outside in. What are the thresholds in the world? What are the expectations of us? What do stakeholders think of us? Because all of those directly impact the value of the business. And it should be said explicitly that nothing that we're talking about is about creating just societal value or charity or corporate social responsibility. This is value to the business. It's just not always measured very well, right? But it's huge. The intangible values that you create in your business are enormous and are the vast majority of the market cap of most companies now. And so these are the things I think the leader has to come in and do, is get a real sense of their purpose. Are there other leaders? Are there staff on board? When new leaders come in, I mean, we talk about it in the book. Paul came in with this big push on sustainability. 70% really of the top 100 were, quote, refreshed, which is a nice, euphemism for there was turnover. And I think that's part of what those first 90 days are about too. Do you have the right people on the bus, as Jim Collins says?
So let me ask you thanks. That's a great question, and I'm sure very helpful to everyone in the room. Let's look at it in a different frame of context. You're running an existing business today. We're in the midst of a pandemic. So, sometimes I hear record sales, record losses. You got DEI coming at you. You got a whole bunch of things coming. How do you position what we're talking about today? How do you create time for this, even in the short term? Because you're battling, for a lot of SMEs, some of them battling cash flow, right? You could have hundreds of millions of dollars of sales. It doesn't mean anything if you're losing money right now. And many of them can't even forecast for the next year. So how do you bring what we're talking about today into a strategy meeting or give it the time?
I think this has been kind of the work I've been doing for 20 years, is to ask companies and executives to think about this in an integrated way and not think of it as additional work. When you do that, it's always easy to cut it when things are down. It's easy to think it's not core to value creation. But if you flip it and say, okay, this is just how we run a business. For example, companies will set, targets in ESG issues. And some will say, well, we can't set 50 targets because, we can't keep track of that. I'm like, but it's not one person to keep track of it. There's one over here that's for the procurement guy. That's one for the marketing person. It's just part of the business now, just like they all have different financial targets and different marketing targets. You have targets related to your environmental and social performance and how it integrates with the business. So it's really about integrating it. So I think it's similar to saying years ago, it would have been like, how do we talk about all this IT stuff? This new internet thing, right? And do you remember when Bill Gates said, oh, we got to become an internet company, right? It just said, we have to be this now. I think that's what I try to get people to see about sustainability. This is just how you operate. The way IT, the way quality, the way lots of other dimensions have just become how we do business. It is more complicated. It is more elaborate. I had a CEO once say to me that he was a food and beverage company, and he said, a responsible product used to just be, is it safe and, does it taste good? That was it. Does it not kill you? And he said, now it has to be responsibly sourced and manufactured and distributed. This is just how it is, right? It's just a more complicated world. And so I don't think it's about time. Now, the SME thing is obviously, if you're just barely staying afloat, cash flow is number one, but I just encourage people to think that part of what gives you loyalty in your customer base and your community and your employees is the kinds of products you sell. And most of the growth in a lot of sectors like food, personal care, are all more sustainable companies. The growth engines are really, and the ones that are getting bought up by the big guys are just, they have sustainability at their core. They're trying to produce products that are serving customers that want more sustainable products. And that's a growing body. So I think there's a lot about this agenda that SMEs, not only is it good for them, but they actually can lead on. I think the innovation agenda is often SME driven, right? Most real changes in a sector don't come from the big guys. And we talk about that in the book. I mean, Unilever kind of admits consumer products companies will claim they're the innovators, but it's really their suppliers and it could be smaller guys they buy up. And so I think about the SMEs as the innovation drivers. They can start often with a fresh a clean slate and think differently about, the metrics of the business and its purpose.
That's great. So we got 20 minutes left. I want people to start putting in some questions in the chat, not the chat box, there's a Q&A box, but I also have a couple of questions from some members that had sent it out earlier. So Boris Martin is the CEO of Engineers Without Borders in Canada. This question: is there a real clear link between talent retention and attraction and a company's decisions to promote sustainability, social causes? Is there data available on that? And if there is, are company CEOs taking it seriously?
Yes, and maybe. I think, yes, there's lots of data. We have some in the book. I mean, some of it's anecdotal. Some of it's just you talk to CEOs and it's clear to them that they're getting questions from these young kind of now Gen Z or young millennials as they come in, even to just interview. They ask questions about sustainability. But, companies do surveys all the time of their employees. Unilever knows and has the data that 75+% of the people that come there are coming there because of its sustainability performance. It is, when they talk about the benefits they've had, they don't talk as much about outperforming peers in the stock market, or, they talk about some of the benefits to the world that they've tried to enable, but often they go right to, we're the most in-demand employer. Like, they measure this, right? And for Unilever, in the 56 or so countries that they recruit in kind of actively at colleges and business schools, they are the number one in-demand employer in like 25 of those or 24 of them. I mean, that includes versus like Apple and, and Amazon, and they'll joke, we make soap and shampoo. Like, what's so exciting? And in their field, in the consumer thing, they're top, company in 54 of the 56, something like that. The exact numbers are in the book, but I think there's lots of data. There's lots of data from Edelman surveys about kind of employees and Gallup, so much about engagement, so many surveys and data about engagement levels driving better performance, and then showing that purpose and meaning and knowing what your company does and believing in it drives engagement. So, I mean, there's kind of this chain of data that seems kind of obvious when you step back and think about it, but is especially true for the younger generations. The data on that is very clear. What they believe a company is for has expanded. Millennials have a view, and it's pretty dramatic majorities, and then Gen Z's even much more. 90% will say that a company should do more than just serve its profit goals. It has to serve society as well. Just a different view, and I think it's going to be hard to recruit if you're not getting that and kind of being honest about it and being clear.
Great. Boris, thanks for the question. So we got a couple actually coming in through here too, live right now. Matt Thompson asks, are ESG initiatives affecting share prices and valuations?
Yeah, they are. It's a really interesting and tough thing to parse out, right? This is a much longer conversation, but I think the ESG world, the reason we're saying ESG now for the word sustainability was dominant. It's still there, but ESG has become the word in the last year or two is because investors are there, and that's their phrase. And they're the ones now kind of pushing these questions, starting with, BlackRock and Larry Fink, as you mentioned earlier. So it drives valuations in that there's so much more demand. PwC says about half of global assets will be in some form of sustainability or ESG fund. So clearly, as money pours into these funds, it drives up demand for the companies that have higher ESG ratings. There's a whole conversation about those ESG ratings and how do you know if a company is more sustainable and all these things. I think I'm very clear that the legitimate ESG actions drive value creation, and then how that ties to shareholder price is part of, do you believe that the market is logical or random?
Irrational, yeah.
Irrational. I mean, there's some rationality, there's some unbelievable irrationality to it, and some short-termism, right? Over half the shares are sold in milliseconds. So I think you're seeing it, and there's data, like Larry Fink quoted, that in 2020, the ESG or socially responsible investment funds, 81% outperformed their benchmarks, outperformed their benchmark indices. I think that's great news. I hate to put too much stock in, that's a pun, but too much stock in the stock market and what it says about the value of a company because of that irrationality. But at least it's saying it's pretty hard for an investor to say we're going to lose money going into sustainable business and ESG. I'll just point out quickly that there's never been a investment strategy that's had to prove that it always outperforms. I see that question. I get that question about ESG. Does it outperform? if someone starts a new tech fund, they don't go, are you going to guarantee that it outperforms? There's something about ESG where they're like, well, it must be anti-business. So if you could guarantee that that strategy would outperform, all the money in the market would go there. I mean, I hate to be like totally simplistic about it, but it's a weird goal, right? I think, does it seem like it helps screen for good, well-managed companies? Yes, that's been clear for years.
Where do you actually see it in the next 5 years? Because if you think about it 5 years ago on the ESG or impact investing, all that, it was so early stages. It was, in the capital markets, people looked at sort of throwing away money, good money after bad money. Right. People were just saying, we are today where it's actually, you got Larry talking about, you got a lot of funds now talking about the sophistications there. Where do you see it in 5 years from today? Is it almost just, this is just reality and it's in you, you have to do it or you don't exist?
Yeah, of course. I like, it's just becoming, look, the structure of, reporting and transparency is being built right now. Just like there's the three major financial sheets that we learn about in business school that took centuries to get to, right? And there's FASB and all these standards boards. Those are being built around ESG now. There's at the global climate meeting, there was an announcement about the ISSB, an international standards board. There's starting to be harmonization of the requirements in lots of different stock markets around the world and the demands for transparency about materiality, your climate impacts. Those things are not going away. Like once you start demanding transparency, that's not going away. I mean, I see questions in the Q&A kind of building on this ESG, like, is it going to be transitory? And that's part of your question. All I can say is that now that I've been in this for 20 years, which is just shocking. I was like the young guy in this field when I got into it. I've seen multiple recessions. And in the past, sustainability's just died out, or they've actually furloughed or gotten rid of sustainability people in companies. That didn't happen in the pandemic. It actually accelerated. The sustainability advisory world just exploded. All the big consulting firms kind of reinvested in it. I got more calls, whatever I can tell anecdotally, in my business. So something changed. And I think it's not just the Larry Finks, the investors. The reason they're so convinced is a lot of these mega trends that are ESG, like climate, we're not debating models on a spreadsheet anymore. It's happening, right? I mean, there's fires in California 10 times bigger than they were 5-10 years. This is happening. And companies are not really debating that anymore. And again, those younger generations, what I've heard from investment companies, I was at an event for USB. The head of private wealth said they surveyed globally their private wealth, which drives a lot of strategy in banks. And the number one thing the wealthy families were asking about was impact investing, not how do I set up my grandkids? Because basically the millennials who are on track to inherit $30 trillion from boomers in the next generation, they have different views about this and they want impact investing. So that's why I think it's not going away, because it's only getting more true for younger investors.
It's funny, I think about it often that the pandemic was it's a trauma, right? When you think about leaders changing the way they behave, what usually gets them to change is a heart attack, or you get fired, or something happens.
Right.
You're asking the world to change here, and it takes these crazy events. Pandemic is a huge one, and relating it back. Forest fires, it's almost a reinforcement. And as long as those things continue and accelerate, which is happening, it's hard to see this stuff departing because it's front of mind. Well, the question is, are we going to be there fast enough, right, before it becomes uncontrollable?
Well, you have to work really hard to deny climate change at this point. I mean, you have to work at it. I mean, it's just the data. I mean, it's just impossible, right? And I don't see. I mean, even in Florida, they just the governor was just doing something about sea level rise, and he said something. It's not going to be a liberal agenda, but there's no conservative or liberal agenda about, are the keys going to be underwater in 20 years? That's not an agenda. That's just happening. And I grew up in South Florida, and it's hard for me to watch. But parts of the world are not going to be recognizable. It's that serious, and in a way, it's underplayed in the media, like how serious this is. And it's hard if you work in this field to kind of know what's really going on.
Well, take a look at dangerous Florida real estate prices. That's what
I
mean.
You're starting
Nothing
to see
is people. They spiked 20% in the last year. But so the mentality is still not long term. It requires the flooding has to actually continue or start before people realize and the thing comes crashing down.
Right. Well, no, they'll be right. That's the thing about, everything's spiking. Real estate. I just saw this whole thing on CNN. There's huge spikes right now. But honestly, people building and spiking in Miami Beach is crazy to me. But I think what's going to happen is the underwriting of like a 30-year mortgage will disappear in the next 5 years, because you do the math and 30 years out and that house will be in trouble. So I think you'll see a collapse in certain parts of real estate. just because the insurance and mortgages aren't there, the value's not there.
That's interesting. So I'm going to, Barbara Cecil has a question. Can large scale and sustainability coexist? Do we need to be focusing our business approaches to consider local more?
Yeah, look, this is a version of the hardest question, and I get it. And it's tough to answer quickly, but it's about the growth agenda. Can an economy that serves 9 or 10 billion people actually still be sustainable? I punt on this in some sense to say, well, it better be. Like, we don't have a choice. It's a constraint-based view of the world. There's going to be 9 or 10 billion people. We have this much planet. We better figure out how. And there's, significant interest in initiatives in circular economies, regenerative solutions, so that we can find a way within the resources of the planet to provide quality of life for everyone. And the scale isn't going away, right? Walmart's not going to break up. The smaller companies, the SMEs or the mid-size that are more sustainable, like a Patagonia, they don't want to be that big. Like, we can't wait for them to take over. They don't want to. They're not going to. So we have to change the current large companies and large economies. But it means doing things in a very different way, right? And in a totally decarbonized way with circular materials. And it's very different with justice and living wages. I mean, all these things need to happen. It's hard. Nothing about this is really easy. I think we have to use the scale to our advantage. And that's kind of what we're proposing in Net Positive, is become a positive impact as a company. And then you want the big guys, the ones who are doing it right, you want them to grow. You want them to take more share, to provide more of the solutions to people, more of the products and services, if they're doing it in a sustainable way. So I think we have to use the scale to our advantage. Companies are way too big, right? They're just the vast majority of capital flows in the world, the vast majority of jobs, and on and on. And that's part of the case we make in the book, is this has to be a partnership of government, business, and civil society. They all have to be moving.
What do you think about, I come back to consumer product goods companies, right? The idea of growth and innovation, it's a necessity for them to continue to push it and drive some type of shareholder value in the future. And then you talk about the millennials, the Gen Zs coming up behind them, and their whole new mindset and the importance of sustainability to them. But yet, let's take Apple. Let's think about iPhones. iPhone 13 just came out. They're also the first people to go out and buy iPhone 13s. And so is there a mixed message here? Like, do they not see what we're filling the landfills with as well? So I got two issues with it. One is innovation is also driving problem here because it's still growth. You're just substituting products all the time. And the consumer today, driven by a lot of the younger consumer, they're looking for the new and the latest thing, which isn't helping landfills here.
Yeah, it's a weird mix right now.
It's crazy.
It's crazy because, I think everything about technology in our lives is kind of different than we've had. And that's why I said before, I think Facebook is one of the most important stories in the world. We're at a scale of connection and use of technology. I mean, look, there's arguments that have been made for years that a single iPhone replaces like 12 to 15 devices. So you could argue, and there's a legitimate case, that the footprint of that thing is much smaller than when we had a camera and a phone and, we had like 10 different things. That's true. But even within that, you don't need a new one every 2 years, right? And it's a bummer when your 4-year-old iPhone the apps stop working and you have to get a new one. But Apple, it's interesting. They just kind of said they're going to allow repair, which was something they were fighting for years. That's a much more sustainable path than buying a new one, substituting just components of it. I think we're going to go down that path. It's a weird mix with the younger generations because you're right about technology. They want the new thing, but they're also, in a lot of categories, like say clothes, really into secondhand, right? And just a huge growth in wanting a simpler lifestyle, but simple for everyone now includes their phone with them at all times and on. I think it's a whole other conversation, but what we're doing to ourselves with technology is really, I think, kind of frightening. And I'm addicted to it as well, but I watch people. I was at a concert for the first time a week ago, and I watched the guy in front of me not able to put his phone away and just posting on Instagram and Facebook about being at the concert. And I was like, put the thing away, like enjoy the band. It was, and the young people, they don't even question it, right? I see it with my teenagers. I have Gen Zs, and we lost the battle on keeping the devices, any kind of reason. They're on all the time. So yes, you're right, but it's a weird mix. It's a really weird mix.
Yeah. I'm going to go to Keith Beckley. So Keith spoke at our conference this guy's so passionate about EV energy and stuff. Any idea what is happening with ESG outside the Western democracies, i.e., large part of the world's economy, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't see any reporting about any of that.
Well, you do there. I mean, and it's hard. I mean, look, I'm American, so I see the sustainability stuff here more. But Paul, my co-author, is European, and he travels the world and is the most connected person I've ever met. And I've been doing, because of the virtual thing, I've been doing a lot of international stuff. I've spoken a few times for South Korean businesses in the last couple of months. And I will say that what I've heard, and for an Indian event, I've heard from repeatedly from business organizations in Korea to this business organization in India, that they're all getting pressure to do ESG. They're part of the value chain. They're all part of the same kind of transparency pressure. They're feeling like they have to put out these ESG reports, and they're doing it. And some of those countries actually have transparency and reporting requirements in their stock markets, but they also express that they feel like it's a Western thing, like it's being imposed upon them. And so I think I've been thinking about this a lot, like how will it proliferate, or how will it look in different countries? The way I try to talk about this is to say ESG is not being imposed from Europe or America because it's like a fad. It's because, as I said before, it's like external threshold based. The imposition's coming from the planet, climate and air and water, and the need to kind of provide sufficiency for billions of people. Like, that's the pressure. So I think it's then maybe up to different cultures or different styles of business to think about how do they execute against that, rather than worrying too much about the terminology. And I've had a really interesting discussion with publishers. We're starting to, get the translations done in multiple languages, and all my books have been done in Korean, but there's been this resistance there because they're just getting ESG, not sure they want to hear about net positive. So there is this kind of pushback. And I don't know how it'll play out. I think, again, I think if we concentrate more on, you're trying to solve a problem and help solve problems for the world, not answer Western reporting requirements. Think of it that way. And I think it will help the companies be more innovative and flexible.
I got to go to a question. I know we're running tight on time, but Mike Welling, who used to work at Unilever, was the chief marketing officer, I think, here in Canada. So he brings up a pretty interesting. Today, Biden is hosting a virtual conference on democracy. The press is full about speculation of Trump's resurgence in 2024. I was just in the US too. It sounds like Trump is on a path for the Republican nomination. If he's reelected, he is demonstrating the past of disregard for facts. Does a re-election risk impacting a focus on sustainable, or have we actually gone beyond that now?
Look, we only have a couple minutes left. This is a really long conversation, but I will say that I've spent 20 years working on climate, and I always tell people I don't think it's the most important thing because I work on it. I worked on it because I think it's the most important thing. And I actually think the most important thing right now is protecting democracy. The boards of NGOs and things I'm on, I've been pushing this, saying, if you're pushing for climate action, great. But if we don't protect democracy and who's in power, frankly, in the US, there will be no action on climate from the US. So yes, it's incredibly dangerous, not so much just because he disregards facts, but because he's authoritarian, right? And there's a real danger. And a disregard for facts coming from the entire government is really scary and dangerous, and you see it brewing. So yes, I'm worried. I lose sleep over this. I think it's really, really dangerous what's happening. I think at the state level, voter suppression is real and very dangerous. But I think the question of then, what does that do to sustainability? I think, yes, the government won't help here. And that means it's going to be up to other places and multinationals. Again, they're not going to, just like with the recession, they didn't stop. Companies aren't going to stop cutting their footprint, trying to get to zero carbon, because it's just based on what the world needs and what they're finding is more and more profitable. So I don't think that'll stop, but a US that's under authoritarian control and one that has no interest in climate action is not good for the world, right? I mean, we are a quarter of the world's economy, and we have enormous power in the international discussions. It's going to be hard for the world to cut emissions as fast as it needs to if we don't have people in power who actually believe in climate change. So I think the world's at stake, honestly, in these next couple of elections.
Andrew, thank you so much for being with us today. What nobody in this room realized was we started late. You had other things on your mind. I know your kids were evacuating a school, and we didn't talk about it at the beginning, but did they make it out okay?
Yeah, I got a text from my wife. She picked up my son. There was a message on a board or in the bathroom that was scary and dangerous about shooting. And So the kids kind of all funneled out of the school and they're off having some cocoa with some friends and just trying to calm down, I think. So I'll see them in a little bit. But yeah, it was a little scary, but I think you hope it's just overblown,
crazy.
Right? Scary times.
It's ridiculous. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your thoughts on these many questions. And I know the conversation could go on for hours around this, and we got a great audience here. So
thank you.
Listen, if you're interested in any more of our Wave Forward live webcasts, please visit us at po-leadership.com. You'll find a number of our past webcasts there. Janice Stein is there. Janice Stein just recently spoke at our conference. Kim Scott, Trier, Bryant, Erica, Dawan, Morgan Housel, Joe Jackman, Harry Krim. The list goes on. It's been a fantastic year. So please check it out. Finally, in concluding our session today, it's our last one of the year. So I'd like to wish you all the best for the holidays and a healthy, happy new year. And from all of us here at PO Leadership. And we look forward to seeing you in 2022.
Your ambition makes you think, what if? It's what drives you to believe in your idea and its potential. It opens doors to a whole new world of possibilities, new inventions, and better ways of working. What if you worked with trusted advisors who understood your owner mindset and how to unlock the full potential of your private business to create long-term value in this transformative age? Together, we can turn your what if into why not. EY Private, advisors to the ambitious.